there you are, my friend. Come and sit with me for a while. The fire has settled into a steady rhythm tonight, the kind that does not demand attention, only presence. Let your hands rest where they are. Let the day loosen its grip, piece by piece. There is nothing you need to hold on to now. You do not need to listen closely. This story knows how to find its way, even if your thoughts wander elsewhere. Whispergrove does not mind when the mind drifts. In fact, it prefers it that way. Tonight I will tell you about a tree, a single tree in the magical forest of Whispergrove, standing along a path I have walked more times than I could ever count. It is not a story about danger, nor about great magic. It is a story about noticing, about what happens when something has been calling for a long time, quietly, without ever learning how to raise its voice. There is a path in Whispergrove that feels older than memory, though it is not marked by stones or signs. It winds gently through the forest, never in a hurry, never entirely straight. I have walked it in every season the forest has offered me. In spring, when new leaves tremble at the thought of existing. In summer, when the canopy grows thick and generous. In autumn, when the ground softens beneath falling gold. In winter, when even the air seems to listen more carefully. Along that path stands a tree. I could not tell you when I first noticed it, only that it has always been there, just off to the side, close enough to see without ever demanding to be seen. It is not the tallest tree, nor the widest. Its bark is not unusually patterned. Its branches do not stretch farther than the others around it. And yet each time I passed, my gaze would linger just a moment longer than necessary. Not long enough to stop. Only long enough to feel that something had brushed against my awareness. And then I would continue on. On the evening this story truly begins, Whispergrove was easing itself toward rest. The mist lay low among the roots, drifting slowly, as though undecided about where it wished to settle. The air carried that familiar stillness that comes when the forest begins to exhale after a long day of being itself. Crickets had softened their song. Fireflies moved with less urgency, their lights appearing and fading as gently as thoughts just before sleep. Even my steps felt quieter than usual, cushioned by moss and time. As I approached the familiar stretch of paths, I felt it again. That subtle pull, not a tug, not a warning, just an awareness, steady and patient, waiting to be acknowledged. I slowed as I passed the tree. For the first time I allowed myself to stop wondering why it felt different, and instead asked what I was actually sensing. I stood there, my staff resting lightly against the earth, and listened. The forest around the tree was calm, deeply so. The ground felt settled beneath my boots. The air moved evenly, without tension. Everything nearby seemed content to rest. Everything except the tree. Once I noticed it, I could not unnotice it. The leaves still clung to its branches, though the season had long invited them to fall. They did not dry nor brittle. They simply waited, as if unsure whether they were allowed to let go. The bark beneath my palm was warm, unexpectedly so, holding on to the heat of something deeper than sunlight. And in the space around the tree, there was a faint rhythm, a pulse slow and steady, like a breath that never quite reached its end. It was not loud, it was not urgent, but it was constant. The tree was awake, not restless, not afraid. Awake in the way one remains awake when one believes sleep is not permitted. I rested my hand more fully against the trunk, feeling the warmth beneath the rough bark. "You've been here a long time," I murmured, though I did not know why I spoke aloud. Perhaps I needed to hear the words myself. The tree did not respond. Trees rarely do, at least not in ways that resemble conversation. But the pulse did not quicken or retreat. It remained as it was, steady and unyielding. I could have walked on then. I had done so many times before. The path waited patiently behind me, familiar and forgiving. But this time, I did not go. I set my staff against the trunk and lowered myself to the moss at the tree's base. The ground was cool and soft beneath my hands, alive with quiet movement. The forest did not react to my decision. It simply made room for it. "I've passed you many times," I said softly. "I think I see that now." The words were not an apology. They were an acknowledgement. And sometimes in Whispergrove that is enough to begin. I stayed until the night grew deeper. I listened to the way the pulse in the air never slowed, to how the roots beneath the soil felt taut, as though bracing against a weight that no longer pressed down from above. I listened to the forest breathing around the tree, sleeping soundly, untroubled by whatever had once required watchfulness. When at last I rose to leave, I did so reluctantly, as though walking away from a thought that had not yet finished forming. I returned the next night, and the night after that. Each time the tree was the same, awake, steady, unmoving in its vigilance. Sometimes I spoke to it, offering nothing more than the sound of a human voice resting gently in the air. Other times I said nothing at all, content to sit and listen. Slowly patterns began to reveal themselves. The pulse around the tree was strongest near its roots, fading gradually into the surrounding ground. The earth there felt older, layered with memory. The farther I walked from the trunk, the quieter everything became, until the forest returned to its deep, untroubled rest. It was then that understanding began to take shape. This tree was not restless because something was wrong. It was restless because something had once been very right. Long ago, before I had ever walked this path, something here had needed guarding. A place, perhaps, a moment, a crossing of time when the forest required vigilance, and the tree had answered without question. It had stood watch while others slept. It had held the responsibility alone, faithfully, for as long as it was asked. But time moves differently in Whispergrove. What is necessary one season may become unnecessary the next. The forest adapts, the land heals, dangers fade into memory, and yet the tree had not been told. No one had returned to release it from its task. No voice had come to say, "You may rest now." And so it continued, not out of fear, but out of loyalty, out of a belief that stopping would mean failing something it had promised to protect. Understanding this, I felt no urge to hurry. Some responsibilities are not undone quickly. They must be set down with care. That night I walked the ground around the tree, tracing the path its roots followed beneath the soil. Everywhere I went, the forest was calm. There were no lingering signs of danger, no echoes of unrest. Only earth that had learned how to be quiet again. The watch was no longer needed. The tree simply did not know it yet. I stayed until morning. I leaned my back against the trunk as the stars slowly shifted overhead, their light dimming as dawn approached. The forest remained peaceful through the night. Nothing stirred that required guarding. Nothing asked for protection. As the first pale light touched the edge of Whispergrove, I rested my palm against the bark once more. "You don't have to do this alone anymore," I said quietly. "You don't have to stay awake for something that has already passed." For the first time, the pulse in the air changed. It did not stop, but it softened, as though something had finally allowed itself to consider another way of being. And I knew then that the tree had been heard. I did not leave at dawn. Instead, I remained seated at the base of the tree, letting the light arrive slowly, as it always does in Whispergrove. Morning here never rushes. It seeps into the forest in careful layers, touching moss and bark long before it ever reaches the sky. The tree stood quietly above me, its leaves still holding, its warmth steady beneath my hand. But something had shifted during the night. The pulse that had filled the air around it no longer felt strained. It was still there, still present, but it carried a different quality now, less like a held breath and more like a sigh waiting to happen. I rose slowly and walked the path in a wide circle around the tree. Not to search for danger, but to let the forest show me what it already knew. The ground was calm, the air was untroubled, roots lay loose and uncoiled beneath the soil, no longer gripping as though bracing for impact. Wherever this tree had once stood watch, the watch had long since ended. The forest had simply moved on. I returned to the tree and rested my palm against its bark again. "You did what you were asked," I murmured, "and you did it well." The words felt important to say, even if no one else would ever hear them. That evening I brought nothing with me except time. I sat once more at the tree's base as night fell, listening to the forest settle around us. The stars emerged one by one through the canopy, their light gentle and distant. Fireflies drifted lazily through the air, unconcerned by anything that might require attention. Nothing did. And still the tree remained awake. Not because it had not heard me, but because knowing something and believing it are not always the same thing. I returned the following night, and the night after that. Sometimes I slept against the trunk, letting my breathing rise and fall where the tree could feel it. Other times I remained awake, keeping quiet company, offering nothing more than presence. I did not hurry. I did not try to convince. Some things let go only when they feel safe enough to do so. On the fourth night, I noticed the leaves tremble. Not with wind. There was none. They trembled as if responding to a decision being made slowly, carefully, deep within the wood itself. A few loosened their hold and drifted down, landing softly on the moss at my feet. The forest did not react. It did not need to. The tree was beginning to understand. I stood and walked once more around the ground it guarded, this time tracing the path with deliberate steps, letting my presence be known. I paused at each place where the roots pressed deepest, resting my hand there, listening. Everywhere, the same quiet answered back. The forest was awake enough now to hear what the tree had never been able to say. When I returned to the trunk, I spoke softly, not as instruction, but as reassurance. "You're not the only one here anymore," I said. "The forest remembers now." The pulse slowed, not abruptly, just enough to notice. That night, the tree slept. It was not dramatic, there was no sound, no sudden change, but the air around it softened completely. The steady vigilance easing into something gentler. The warmth beneath the bark deepened, becoming less focused, more even. The last of the leaves loosened their grip and fell, settling into the moss as though they had always belonged there. The tree had not fallen. it had rested. I remained until morning, leaning against the trunk, letting my own rest mirror its. When dawn arrived, it did so without resistance. The forest breathed easily, unburdened by watchfulness. I stood at last and placed both hands against the bark. "Sleep well," I whispered. And for the first time since I had known it, the tree did not answer with effort. It answered with silence. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye near the roots. A small piece of bark had loosened during the night, falling gently onto the moss. It was smooth and warm to the touch, carrying the same steady heat the tree now held within itself. I lifted it carefully, feeling no pull of magic, no command, only comfort. I slipped it into my pocket, understanding without words that it was not a gift of power. It was a reminder, something to hold on nights when rest feels undeserved. Something to remember what happens when something that has carried too much is finally allowed to stop. I left the tree then, returning to the path I had walked so many times before. But the forest felt different now, not changed exactly, but settled in a way I had not noticed until it happened. Some responsibilities do not end with action. They end with being seen. The fire beside you crackles softly as the story draws to a close. The embers glow low and steady, casting slow shadows that rise and fall with the breath of the night. That is the story of the tree that would not sleep. Not because it was broken, not because it was afraid, but because no one had told it that it could finally rest. The forest does not speak loudly when it needs help. Neither do many things worth listening to. Some calls are quiet, some are patient, some have been waiting longer than we realize. The fire settles, your breathing slows. There is nothing you need to do now, nothing you need to carry. Outside the circle of warmth, Whispergrove rests easily, whole and untroubled. The paths wait, the trees stand quietly. And somewhere along a familiar trail a tree sleeps at last. I'll stay here a while longer, tending the embers, listening to the forest as it breathes. You are safe to rest. Good night, my friend. Let the night hold you gently until morning comes.